I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. Messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for December the 2nd, 2025. We are fully in winter here now in North Texas. We've had some very cold days, and I've got the heat on here in my office. It's a far cry from 6.5 weeks ago when I was still wearing short sleeves and, yes, even shorts. And it's an indication of how quickly things are indeed changing, not only seasonally, but perhaps also in our world. And the ongoing questions we've got about today's Messianic faith community. All right, so today in our theology roundup, we're going to be discussing something which I believe is very important, although it doesn't tend to get a huge amount of traction out there in the Messianic world of ideas, at least in my experience. And that concerns the everlasting covenant in Isaiah 24:5. What is actually being spoken of there? If you'll turn with me to the Messianic Apologetics website, messianicapologetics.net, click on the FAQs tab, frequently asked questions, and these are the entries from the year 2000 to 2018, so all the way back to the old TNN Online Theology News Network website. They're listed in alphabetical order. Go down to the letter I, because this is Isaiah 24:5. Go down to the letter I, click Isaiah 24:5, and a PDF file will open up. And as you can see from the question, this is something which is highly relevant, especially as it involves Jewish and non-Jewish believers in the contemporary body of Messiah. The question, what am I to make of Isaiah 24:5? Are Gentiles responsible for violating the Mosaic covenant every bit as much as the Jews? Or does Isaiah 24:5 only speak of the Noahic covenant? Okay, so this is an important question. This is an important passage to consider. All right, let's go to Isaiah 24:1-6. Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like her mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns and withers, the world fades and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth fade away. The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. Isaiah 24:1-6, New American Standard. All right, so there's a lot in that passage, of course. The content of Isaiah chapter 24, describing God's inevitable judgment on the world, is something which has probably been too widely overlooked in regard to understanding salvation and what only the work of the Messiah can redeem people from. That God will issue severe desolation and calamity upon unrighteous sinners can be easily detected by a survey of Isaiah 24. That this chapter depicts the world at large in a condition of rebellion and corruption against the Creator is also easily detected. there should be no disagreement from an historical reading of Scripture that Israel proper had been found in violation of the Mosaic covenant. And this was the precise reason why the new covenant providing permanent atonement for sin and forgiveness would have to be inaugurated. Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27. But what about the nations at large? Could Bible readers possibly deduce that those of the world at large, perhaps total pagans, were to be regarded as breakers of the Mosaic covenant as well? Are they to all be viewed as though they were gerim, or sojourners, who would enter into the community of ancient Israel and whose overall adherence to the Torah had more in common than not from the native? Or are the nations of the world at large just held accountable for a small series of moral and ethical principles per what many categorize as the Noahide laws? The assertion of Isaiah 24:5 is, Ki avru torot chalful chok heperu brit olam. Because they have transgressed the Torot, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. The Jerusalem Bible by Koren. Much understandably comes down to how a reader approaches the presence of Torot, or laws, and Brit Olam, or eternal everlasting covenant. The violation of these divine institutions is something which haaretz, or the earth, is responsible for, making it a problem for all of humanity. There are interpreters of Isaiah 24:5 who view Brit Olam as only being in regard to the covenant God made with Noah in Genesis 9:16. And so this problem would not constitute the nations at large being held liable for breaking any successive covenants which followed. A Jewish commentator like I.W. Zlotke notes some of the options which sit before the reader on how to approach Brit Olam. Quote, the Torah of Moses was given at Sinai between God and Israel, Rashi. Others refer the phrase to the Noahide covenant made between God and the human race after the flood, Genesis 9:16. According to this covenant, every member of the human race is subject to certain moral laws, one of which is the prohibition of murder, Genesis 9:5 following, Abarbanel, unquote. The presence of Torot, or laws, being mentioned does certainly give the interpreter of Isaiah 24:5 some options which would make limiting this verse's content to the Noahic covenant more than a bit confining. At the very least, an evangelical Protestant commentator like John and Oswalt directs how the laws in view included principles which would be included in the Torah of Moses, but does draw the conclusion how the general covenant in view is likely the Noahic covenant. Quote, Isaiah is thus using law here, just as Paul uses it in Romans 1-3. It is not so much the revealed law of the Jews, although the principles are the same. Rather, it is the fundamental principles of human behavior that are as accessible and as incumbent as the elementary principles of physics. Whether or not persons recognize the principles, living in any other way than in accord with them must ultimately destroy us, as the history of numberless fallen civilizations ought to teach us. Thus, while the eternal covenant may have specific reference to the Noahic covenant in Genesis 9:1-17, with its prohibition of bloodshed, its broader reference is to the implicit covenant between creator and creature, in which the creator promises abundant life in return for the creatures living according to the norms laid down at creation. Unquote. The point made by Oswalt is that the Brit Olam, or eternal covenant, violated by the world at large, should not be thought in specific terms to just be the Noahic covenant. More is intended by Isaiah 24:5. Gene M. Tucker has to, although somewhat reluctantly, observe, quote, which covenant does the author have in view? The obvious answer is the covenant with Noah, Genesis 9:1-17, since it is called an everlasting covenant and extends to all people and creatures of the earth. On the other hand, the reference to laws and statutes leaves open the possibility that this is the Sinai covenant, Exodus 19 through Numbers 9, unquote. J.C. Holton, even while choosing to view Torah in the book of Isaiah as largely pertaining to the prophet's own teachings and declarations, still has to detail the following in his entry for law in Dictionary of the Old Testament Prophets. Quote, while the book of Isaiah, along with most other Old Testament texts, presents Torah as a divine gift to Israel, it does not picture Torah as Israel's exclusive possession. Instead, one way in which Yahweh intended for the knowledge of God's upright character, tzedek, to spread was by expanding and making more prominent Torah among the nations, unquote. There are, to be sure, theologians and commentators who see Brit Olam, or eternal, everlasting covenant, and Isaiah 24:5 as being widely incorporative of much more than the Noahic covenant. Jeffrey W. Grogan is one who points out that pagans, even without God, should still be regarded as though they were at least violators of the moral statutes stated within Moses' teaching. Quote, modern society is becoming more concerned about the physical pollution of our environment. Isaiah here dealt with the even more tragic and urgent matter of moral pollution, which is as widespread and serious today as it was in the 8th century BC. The language of verse 5 might seem, on the face of it, to be especially appropriate to Israel because of her possession of the Mosaic law. But the content here makes it plain that the whole world is in view. Many commentators see a reference to the Noachian covenant, especially in the phrase the everlasting covenant, which also occurs in Genesis 9:16. It is possible, too, that the prophet had Genesis 3 in mind, particularly in view of his reference to the curse in verse 6. The world as a whole did not possess the moral commandments of God in written form, as in the Mosaic law, but those laws nevertheless represent the will of God for mankind, and mankind is under judgment for their violation. The word disobeyed implies at least some awareness of these moral requirements in the human conscience. Romans 1:18-32, 2:11-16, thus an element of deliberateness in sin, unquote. Among commentators of the book of Isaiah, the most wide-sweeping view of Brit Olam is probably found within the conservatively acclaimed work, The Prophecy of Isaiah by J.A. Meacher. He summarizes, quote, the expression, the everlasting covenant, is used of the Noachic covenant, Genesis 9:16, the Lord's covenant dispensation reaching back to Abraham, Psalm 105:10, the Sabbath within the Mosaic covenant, Leviticus 24:8, and the Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel 23:5, and its future Messianic counterpart, Isaiah 55:3, 61:8. While this whole passage is resonant with flood motifs, it would be mistaken to tie this covenant reference in any way exclusively to Noah, even though its ambiance starts with him. Every covenant dispensation has its regulatory aspect. However undeveloped, it may have been in comparison with the normative Mosaic system. This may be why Isaiah used the plural laws, so as to cover every period and aspect of covenant law giving. Even Abraham, who lived by the broadest of divine precepts, Genesis 17:2, is said to have kept the Lord's laws. Genesis 26:5. In essence, the annulling of the covenant was the refusal to live in the fellowship in which God opened. Unquote. Walter C. Kaiser might have the most all-inclusive view of both Brit Olam, or the Eternal Covenant, as well as Torot, or laws, as he describes the following for Isaiah 24:5 in his book, Preaching and Teaching the Last Things. Quote, "The word for laws is the Hebrew word Torot, the plural for the word Torah, meaning not just the law of God, but also all his authoritative instructions. Notice that this indictment affects all the peoples of the earth. Yet some are hesitant to refer the everlasting covenant to the Abrahamic to Davidic covenant, but attempt to instead refer it back to the Noachic covenant, Genesis 9:16. To be sure, God did call the covenant he made with Noah an everlasting covenant. Moreover, it is also true that this passage in Isaiah 24 does contain allusions to the flood of Noah. However, it is best to understand this everlasting covenant as the one that reached back to Abraham, Genesis 17:7, 13, 19, Psalm 105, 9-10, also 1 Chronicles 16, 15-18, David, 2 Samuel 23:5, and forward to a future Messiah, Isaiah 55:3. The law God had given to David was a law/charter for all humanity. 2 Samuel 7:19, translation mine, meaning Kaiser, not one effective only for Israel. For just as the Abrahamic covenant was to be the means of blessing all the families of the earth, Genesis 12:3, so it is a universal offer here as well. Unquote. While there will continue to be disagreements among theologians, commentators, and interpreters on how to properly approach Isaiah 24:5, the earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant, New American Standard. One is on safe ground to conclude that not only is Israel proper held responsible by God for violating the Torah or law of Moses, but so are the nations at large, even if the exact Torah obedience of the Gerim or sojourners in ancient Israel was not exactly the same as a native, i.e., the native who had a tribal inheritance in the land of Israel. One of the specific indictments, after all, that the Apostle Paul would issue against the nations is that they were covenant breakers, Romans 1:31, American Standard Version. Some would claim, in contrast to Isaiah 24:5, that the nations at large should not be held responsible for violation of anything but the terms of the Noachic covenant. Psalm 147, 19 and 20, for example, says, "He declares his words to Jacob, his statutes and his ordinances to Israel. He has not dealt thus with any nation, and as for his ordinances, they have not known them." New American Standard. Is it not true that the psalmist says of the nations, Mishpatim bal yedaum, they do not know his rules, English Standard Version, or they do not know his laws, New International Version. The main point of Psalm 147, 19 and 20, was to detail how the Torah or instruction of God was specifically given to Israel and how the nations of the world were largely ignorant of God's commandments. It has to be kept in mind how the scriptures bear forth the principle that specific knowledge of many commandments and ordinances is necessary in order to be held specifically accountable for their violation. Romans 5:13. Yet at the same time, as God's image bearers, Genesis 1, 26 and 27, 9:6, James 3:9, each human being has moral and ethical principles impressed onto the conscience. Knowing this is important because Paul used it as a frame of reference to criticize various Jewish believers in Rome who may have boasted because of their circumcision, but who may also have been shown to be less than faithful Torah keepers when pagans who lacked possession of the Torah could actually have kept its weighty principles via their conscience. Romans 2:21 through 27. You, therefore, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Isaiah 52:5, Ezekiel 36:20. Just as it is written, for indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you, who though having the letter of the law and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? Romans 2:21 through 27, New American Standard. To a figure like James the Just, all it took was violation of one single commandment of the Torah or law of Moses to constitute a total violation of it. He said, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, Exodus 20, verse 14, Deuteronomy 5:18, also said, do not commit murder, Exodus 20, verse 13, Deuteronomy 5:17. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. James 2:10 and 11, New American Standard. Here, the prohibitions against adultery and murder from the Ten Commandments were listed. These would surely constitute the sorts of principles imbued upon the human conscience by God as creator. Violation of one of these commandments, either by a Jewish person who grew up in a Torah environment or by a pagan from the nations, merits such a man or woman the status of law breaker, even without some specific knowledge of the Mosaic covenant. By violating its principles of conscience, one from the nations can demonstrate the same base, fallenness, and disregard for the Creator, which a Jewish person who had specific knowledge of it can likewise demonstrate when he or she breaks it. There is a definite conflict, not only of theology, but also spirituality in the Messianic movement today, when some, and I stress some, Messianic Jewish leaders and teachers might claim that the nations at large are not held responsible by God for breaking the Torah. A prophetic word like Isaiah 24:5 says something to the contrary. All of humanity is guilty before God's instruction. Thankfully, we can also take an important cue from Romans 5:20. The law came in so that the transgression would increase, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. New American Standard. Even though the world at large stands condemned for violation of God's Torah and his covenant, his grace has always been greater than his anger. So that, as sin reigned in death, even so grace would reign through righteousness to eternal life through Yeshua the Messiah, our Lord. Romans 5:21, New American Standard. To claim that Yeshua the Messiah was sacrificed only for Israel proper's violation of the Torah and not for that of the nations as well is not the perspective presented in Titus 2:14. Yeshua gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good deeds. New American Standard. Yeshua redeeming people, apa, pases, anomias, or from all lawlessness, English Standard Version, is something which involves both the Jewish people and those from the nations, as all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23, New American Standard. Likewise, all people who turn to Yeshua as Savior are beneficiaries of the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, Hebrews 8, 8 through 12, and with it, the promise for God's instruction to be supernaturally transcribed onto the heart and mind. Now, as we continue in Messianic theology, the development of this or that, are we going to see more of an emphasis on Isaiah 24:5 as it regards Jewish and non-Jewish believers, what they should do, what they should not do? I'm not expecting it, to be honest. But nobody is saying that Jewish and non-Jewish believers are exactly the same. Nobody is saying that we are 100% identical, but I do think there needs to rightfully be a return to emphasizing commonality first rather than differences first. And Isaiah 24:5, in my opinion, indeed speaking of the world at large, violating the everlasting covenant, it stresses a little more than just the Noahic covenant. Non-Jewish believers are to be regarded as though they are Gerim in the Torah, in Israel, the community, meaning that they had far more in common than not with the native. But we know that one law or one Torah theology can stress that native and sojourner in ancient Israel are like virtually the same, which, in my opinion, is unsustainable from a biblical standpoint. But what is sustainable is that they have far more in common than not. Yet the real problem, and this is where we really do need to understand the gravity of our salvation and redemption at times. You break one commandment, it's as though you've broken them all. So some of the finer points that I know the Messianic community gets involved with, I think, what are now fruitless debates about. Look, we have to understand we are all human sinners, and we all require the salvation of Israel's Messiah, his sacrifice on the tree. All right, and that concludes our theology roundup for today. Now, tomorrow we'll have another single topic, but a number of you all have been asking me, and this goes back to before the Thanksgiving break we were on, the Thanksgiving holiday. Would you please do a series on the New Covenant? Well, we've got an article already called What is the New Covenant? But we will be, we'll plan to talk about that sometime within the next few days to get started. That will be a multi-part series and probably will be broken up by the weekend. Okay, that concludes our theology roundup. Now let's get into some news. We do the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is time sensitive and it changes from day to day. We are continually reminded, number one, to be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, pray for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And number three, be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front. And yes, that includes things in the Western Hemisphere as well. We got a few stories from the Middle East, Israel, not that much, but we do have the unfolding situation in Venezuela. We also have peace envoys in Russia right now. They were still meeting with Vladimir Putin before we got started. So we're waiting to see what is going to come or not come from that. But we do have a lot of things going on right now. And yes, they are things we should definitely be concerned about as God's people. Okay, so all the links I'm about to go through, these will be listed later today when this episode is archived at MessianicApologetics.net. Okay, our first story, this is from Open Source Intel Defender, reposting something that Donald Trump put on his Truth Social. In a post made earlier on Truth Social, President Donald J. Trump called for Israel, who currently occupies a large area of southwestern Syria near the Golan Heights, to maintain a strong and true dialogue with Syria, adding that nothing should take place that will interfere with Syria's evolution into a prosperous state. And that's from yesterday at 10:40 a.m., but I didn't see it until after yesterday's episode. So we know that there is the ongoing situation in Syria. The Syrian president visited the White House a number of weeks ago. We know that Israel is principally engaged in activities in Syria to protect the Druze minority and other minority groups. Syria is still in a period of significant transition after Bashar al-Assad left, and now you have al-Jolani as the president. So our president, President Trump, wants Syria to get on its own 2 feet, wants there to be peace and normalization with Israel, wants Syria to be prosperous. We should be praying for that. There are believers in Syria. And one of the things which we are seeing is the president insisting that Israel be careful with some of its actions in Syria. Of course, this is something which changes from day to day. Okay, our next story, and this came across my feed on X. It's from John Spencer. There's a good article he lists here entitled, No, Gaza is not the worst or deadliest war by any measure. And his commentary on this is great analysis and important context. Anyone claiming Gaza is the worst or deadliest conflict by any measure is showing they know little about war, warfare, or modern conflicts. The reality is tragic, but hyperbole is not truth. So I know that many of us, we've heard claims about Israel's genocide in Gaza, and that has been way overstated. And it's been, of course, stirred up to create not only these massive demonstrations from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, but also with that to promote acts of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. So this is a good article. Look, it is a tragedy. There's no question about that. And from the very beginning, believers, Messianic believers, have been praying release of the hostages, peace. Let's see what's going to happen. And yeah, there's been a lot of prophetic speculation along with that. How is this going to play into the end time scenario? But there are a lot of things we definitely need to be watching. We need to be waiting on. We need to be patient. That's not always something which is easy. But we are seeing a lot of things in flux right now as there is a ceasefire, starting and stopping, and we're going to see what unfolds in the coming months, especially with 2026 on our doorstep. All right, here's one from People Magazine. Let me clear my throat. Excuse me. Here's one from People Magazine yesterday, December the 1st, although this is not the only platform which picked it up. King Charles officially removes ex-Prince Andrew's final royal honors. His name shall be erased. King Charles is removing ex-Prince Andrew's final royal honors. All about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's former membership in the Order of the Garter and Royal Victorian Order. Okay, so there are people within the Messianic sphere of influence, I am not one of them, who believes that Prince Charles, now King Charles III, is the anti-Messiah or the Antichrist. And it goes back to a 1998 book, The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. Now, when you see things like this, ex-Prince Andrew, all of these other potential scandals associated with the British royal family, that does not give a huge amount of credence to them being the cradle of the future beast or the anti-Messiah. In fact, as I've said before, the royal family is not really liked that much, in places like Africa, South Asia, the Caribbean, places where there was, intense British colonialism. And the royal family is an endangered species. So this kind of thing doesn't help the cause of Charles or one of the other members of the royal family being the beast. It actually discredits it. But we do like to take a note of these kinds of things because, let's be fair, this kind of a scandal can involve other world leaders, other people out there. We're going to hopefully see the release of more Epstein materials, and you don't have to be some kind of a royal or aristocrat in order to have dirt associated with you. Okay, here's something which I needed to pass on because obviously when we took our 2 days off last week, there was a shooting in Washington. Here, there's a clip from President Trump, 59 seconds. This is passed on from open source intel yesterday afternoon, 3:17 p.m. Trump, I just want to pay my respects to the two National Guard, two incredible people. One is no longer with us. One is looking down and loves her parents. I spoke to her parents the other night, and she's looking down, and she's so proud of her country, and she loved her parents so much. Our prayers are with the families of the National Guardsmen who shot, passed away, recovering. What is this going to do? Pray for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front. There are a lot of things in flux right now. There are a lot of things changing. And what does that signal? Okay, here's something which I know is very, very concerning. This is from Pierre Poilievre. He is the leader of the Canadian opposition in Ottawa. And there's a 31-second clip. We referenced this a number of weeks ago, but now you have the leader of the Canadian opposition, the Canadian Conservative Party. Liberal bloc amendments to C9, that's a law that's presumably getting ready to pass in Canada right now, will criminalize sections of the Bible, Quran, Torah, and other sacred texts. Conservatives will oppose this latest liberal assault on freedom of expression and defend religious freedom, he says. Okay, so our neighbor to the north, Canada, appears to be getting ready to pass a law where if you quote a particular section of a religious text which is condemning of a behavior like homosexuality, are you going to be held criminally liable for that? And here the leader of the opposition says, we're going to fight this very strongly. We're going to fight in favor of religious freedom. But this is a huge road sign. This is Canada, our country, our neighbor to the north. And there are huge numbers of believers in Canada who are going to be affected by this. There's a large Messianic Jewish community in Canada. The current president of the MJAA is from Toronto. So this is something which is very concerning. Will it happen here in America? What are we going to do about our religious freedom online? I mean, these are very big questions as we move ahead. And I don't have any easy answer for it other than every day I pray to the Lord protection from threats, known and unknown. I do that every single day because the only thing we're entitled to as the people of God is to work for the interests of his kingdom and to be protected as we declare the truth in our respective spheres of influence. Okay, we got 6 more stories to go through. All right, so this is from Jesse Waters last night, 7:40 p.m., and there's a 14-minute clip you can watch, but mainly Trump just ordered U.S. warships to surround the narco state of Venezuela as the president holds a high-level meeting at the White House. Leave or else is Trump's final ultimatum to Maduro. So we do have, it appears, an impending conflict in Venezuela. We've got that huge naval task force just north of Venezuela in the South Caribbean Sea. So what's going to happen? I don't know yet. But we have a responsibility to pray for the believers in Venezuela. Pray that this situation, as terrible as it is, does not at all harm those who are true followers of God, true followers of Jesus. Okay, here's something I thought was interesting I should pass along. This is a social media post from Gemma Ulster. This is a channel on Instagram. This is a Jewish family in the United Kingdom. And here they ask the question, or answer the question, if you are Jewish, why do you have a Christmas tree? Now, her main response is, I'm Jewish, my husband is Jewish, and growing up, we celebrated both Christmas and Hanukkah. Adam, her husband, had a Christmas tree and has a lot of non-Jewish family. And I think, and there are a lot of different questions regarding why a Jewish family in a place like the United Kingdom would have a Christmas tree when they're not, like intermarried, where one of the spouses is Jewish, another spouse is Christian, and so they want to honor both Hanukkah and Christmas. They're not Messianic Jews. They don't believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. Why would they have a Christmas tree? And I think one of the main reasons which may need to be brought out, especially as we consider when we are and the growing forces of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is they have a Christmas tree because they want to integrate into mainstream society. That's why they're doing it. They're observing Christmas as Jewish non-believers in Jesus so they can be a part of the mainstream, in this case, British society. And it's not isolated by any means. There are going to be Jewish people here in the United States. We may encounter them, we may not encounter them, but they're going to do Christmas at their homes. Not, well, I got invited to a neighbor's party, or I got invited to some event outside the home. No, they're going to have a Christmas tree at home. They're going to do Christmas on December the 25th alongside Hanukkah, and they're not believers in Yeshua. Maybe they've got extended family who are non-Jewish. They may not be an intermarried couple, and it's so they can blend in, and they can, in their mind, perhaps alleviate claims of anti-Jewishness or anti-Semitism. And to be honest, as we look ahead and we see growing forces of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, it's true. There are going to be a lot of people, a lot of Jewish people in Europe, a lot of Jewish people in North America. They're going to say, okay, it's time to make Aliyah and return to Israel. But among those who are not able to do so, are they going to just, put up a Christmas tree so they can blend in and they don't draw attention to themselves as Jews? The same thing is true with Jews who, of course, it goes back to the 1880 Pittsburgh platform, who eat pork and shellfish so they can just blend in and they can, do kind of the sleight of hand. Well, remember Miss Daisy? What kind of name is this? Werthen? It's a German derivation. Right. And so that's one of the reasons why Jewish people will celebrate Christmas, even if there's no Christian element to it. And there are Messianic Jews who do Christmas for kind of the same reason. I know that some of you all who watch or listen to this podcast who are more in like the one law or Hebrew roots sphere of influence, you don't think about that. But yeah, there are Messianic Jewish people. They'll do Hanukkah, absolutely, but they're getting their Christmas trees right now, and their Christmas tree might be decorated in blue and white and Hanukkah-style decorations. But it is because of we need to let people think we're Christian, we're part of the mainstream society, so we don't get persecuted. That's one of the main reasons. And we don't often discuss this. We often just go off and condemn people. Oh, they're doing Christmas on December the 25th. Don't they know that's pagan? Actually, they're trying to avoid being persecuted for being Jewish. That's the main reason why you see this kind of stuff. All right, from Visegrad 24. Excuse me, this is from this morning, 3:33 a.m. The report, talks between the American and Ukrainian delegations in Florida produced no progress on the issue of territorial concessions. According to ABC News, which cited a source familiar with the meeting, Russia is not ready to discuss a ceasefire, while Ukraine is not ready to make territorial concessions. And then going down, however, the source noted that there were no signs of any breakthrough on the most difficult issues. That's very upsetting, if at all true. This conflict, Russia-Ukraine, it's been going on for almost 4 years. You see analysts who say, look, this has been going on almost as long as the First World War. Something's got to be done. Somebody has got to decide that, they're going to be willing to make the tough concessions. And is it going to happen? Is it at all possible? I don't know. From open source intel today at 6:50 a.m., Netanyahu, in good spirits and with an understanding of our principles, it's possible to reach an agreement with the Syrians. Okay, so we'll see that. We do pray for peace in the Middle East. We don't want to see destruction. And of course, many people, even in the Messianic community, recognize that there's the prophecy of how there's going to be a highway between Egypt through Israel to Syria. And God talks about Egypt, my people, as well as Syria, my people. So you've got these two mortal enemies of Israel now regarded as the people of God. And there's reconciliation and there's peace and everything else. So I'm not sure if that's going to happen or how that's going to happen this side of the second coming. We'll just have to wait and see how things develop. But that's something which we continue to monitor. Okay, and the last two stories are on Russia-Ukraine. Sky News, there's a 41-second clip. Breaking, President Putin blames Europe for hindering peace plan talks. He adds that if Europe wants to fight a war, then Russia is ready now. That's from 9:31 a.m. Then finally, Visegrad. This is from 9:49 a.m. today. Putin, Russia is acting in Ukraine in a surgical way. This is not a war in the direct sense of the word. Okay, and how is that the case when civilians are being targeted? That's what I think a lot of us wonder about. If you were just going to be taking out President Putin, what you consider to be a military danger to the Russian Federation, all right, that would be surgical. You target military and industrial targets. But you've targeted civilians in this conflict. So that's why we wonder, do you really want peace? But we know the Lord is in control, and we know that nothing happens without his knowledge of it. And we do continue to appeal for peace, Russia and Ukraine. All right, and that concludes our news roundup for today. And I hope you all, certainly on what we talked about, Isaiah 24:5, you were pricked a little bit to, I need to go back and look at that passage again. And of course, we definitely know that there are a lot of things out there in the world of ideas, in the Messianic sphere of influence, which can get a lot of people upset, can get a lot of people concerned or worried. But at the same time, we also know that we just do a little bit of investigation. And frequently, we just have to make an adjustment or two here or there. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for our ministry efforts. If you have not, please do visit my website, MessianicApologetics.net. Take a look at the articles available, frequently asked questions, entries, back issues of Outreach Israel News. You can look up some back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, and generally take a look at our different ministry adventures over the years. And please do give a thumbs up to this episode, a heart. It'll certainly help its exposure on social media. We will see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you Shalom, and take care.